Okay, it's 12:03. I'm going to start with in the introductions, and I'm sure more people will join us. To begin with, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Dina Zuvala. I'm a senior lecturer at the ANU College of Law and convener of this seminar series entitled The Politics of International Law, that takes place under the auspices of the Center of International and Public Law at the ANU. Before I proceed any further, I want to, of course, acknowledge that today I'm zooming in from the country of the Nahuatl and Gambri people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And of course, I want to acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands has never been lawfully ceded, and to acknowledge the special responsibilities that come from this for us who teach and research and talk about the law. Today, I'm very, very excited to be welcoming two people who are both two of my favorite colleagues, but also two of my favorite humans, Professor Michael Fakhri and Dr. Imogen Saunders. Professor Fakhri, who is our external speaker, is an associate professor at the School of Law of the University of Oregon. And of course, he's also the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. So he's someone who's straddling this divide between practice and academia. In his academic life, he teaches in the areas of international economic law, commercial law, and food law, and researches currently on the areas of the right to food and agroecology. And he's particularly interested in the ways in which law plays a role in imperialism and capitalism. And he is the author of the much acclaimed Sugar and the Making of International Trade Law that came out with Cambridge University Press in 2014. If you haven't read it yet, I really encourage you to read it. And he's also the co-author, together with Vazuki Nasaya and Luisa Slava, of a path-breaking edited volume entitled Bandung, Global History and International Law, Critical Paths and Pending Futures. And in his work as UN Special Rapporteur, he also, I would say, dare I say, brings together these different strands of his academic work. So an attentiveness to the politics, history, and economics of law and human rights law, and in its intersection, of course, with the right to food, as well as a commitment to grassroots and social movements' understandings of the right to food. Michael today will be in conversation with Associate Professor Imogen Saunders. Imogen is here, a colleague at the ANU College of Law. She's an international law researcher. Her work has been published in field-leading journals, including the American Journal of International Law, the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, and the Australian Yearbook of International Law. Imogen's work straddles the divide between generalism and specialism. So when it comes to specialism, she both researches and teaches in international trade law, which is why she's here today, but she's also an excellent generalist, and her generalist orientation is evident in her recent monograph on the general principles of law as sources of international law that came out earlier this year with Hard Publishing. And she's also part of the collaborative trans-institutional project Backlashes Against International Law. So today we are continuing with our familiar structure for this series. So Michael will be talking for anything between 25 and 30 minutes about the political economy and social power of the right to food, to be followed by a Q&A and conversation and comments by and with Imogen. And at the end, I'm going to open the floor for questions. To make all this process flow a little bit more smoothly, I invite you to send your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box before Michael and Imogen finish with their conversation, and then when they do, I will read out your questions. On that note, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dina, and for the generous introduction and for the invitation. And it's just a pleasure to be here. And I should start. So today I'll be talking about the first report I wrote as the UN Special Rapporteur, which came out about a year ago. And it's partly made in Australia. So I think it's appropriate to talk about it here today. So Dina Suvala and Sandhya Pahuja both were sort of key to helping me write the report, and so there, and as we always say, all errors and ridiculous points are mine, but they really, to put it, the term of art is they saved my butt and jumped in as true comrades, not just colleagues. So I think it's appropriate to talk about this report today. And to be honest, I don't have a memory of writing this report. I really don't. I reread it recently. And so to give you a sense of why, so the pandemic really strikes the world in consciousness in March 2020, right? It's percolating. March 2020, it hits. On May 1st, I became the special rapporteur, so a few months later. And then in late June, early July, I had to submit this report. And again, some person who was called Michael a year ago wrote this, and this is why, you know, I'm just so indebted to Dina and to Sandhya to helping me out. And so what I want to do is I'll talk about the substantive arguments and recommendations I make in this report. And it's a report that is providing an institutional map on how to transform trade law when it comes to food. And in effect, I call for the winding down of the agreement on agriculture, but I also propose something in its stead and a way forward. So to bring down, sort of wind down the agreement on agriculture. And I put forward an idea of how we can use existing doctrine to create international food agreements. So moving from just agriculture to this wider scope of food. But I also want to situate the report within several contexts. And all those contexts stem from the social power, political economy, and legal interpretations of the right to food. So my talk today is going to be very broad, and it's going to touch upon several themes. So I hope the audience can find multiple ways of coming into this. So you don't need to be a trade specialist or a human rights specialist. And I appreciate how Dina, sort of in characterizing Imogen's work on, you know, we all have that, our specialist work, but also the more general approach. So I'll be touching upon sort of what's it mean to be a special rapporteur, and how does one navigate this? And what's that, the relationship as an academic and a practitioner, and how do we draw these lines, and why do we draw these lines? The role of history and how we use history in everyday practice in our argumentation. The relationship between human rights and political economy. So my background, I really come from a law and development perspective, and I find sometimes, I'm doing human rights and I'm a human rights expert, but it's almost like I'm using the language of human rights with an accent, with a political economy accent at times. So I'm always curious when my team in Geneva say, well, that's not human rights, that's political economy. So I'm curious to see what that even means. So these are just some broad strokes of different ways people can find their way into this talk. So I'll provide my own sense of what is and what it means to be a special rapporteur. Then I'll explain why the right to food is better understood as part of the history of trade and development, and not necessarily part of the history of human rights as a field as such. Then I'll explain my argument in the report. And what I'll be doing is sort of outlining how knowing the history of the right to food in the way that I'm going to explain is what allowed me to make doctrinal arguments. And my knowledge of history is what guided me in knowing where to look doctrinally and how to be creative in my interpretive moves. And I haven't read Anne Orford's new book, but I know she's the next speaker. So I wonder if this, and you know, she's been a great inspiration to my own work. So maybe this sort of might have some continuity with the next talk. And then I'll conclude with the political and legal landscape today around trade and the right to food. So at the outset, I want to share with you my notion of change and law. Sort of what's my, I wouldn't call it a theory, but my instinct on the relationship between law and social change. So my thinking is that any legal tool can be used progressively or regressively. You can use human rights to colonize, but you can also use it to emancipate. And it's always a tactical decision which legal tool you want to use and how you use it. And so what matters is the historical and social context of a particular struggle. That's, for me, is where I start looking. And to be honest, I can't imagine being a legal activist without having a sense of history and structural inequality to understand my interventions and how to make those choices. So, and in fact, having a historical sensibility is what keeps me hopeful in these dark and ridiculous times. I think having that sense of not just the longue durée, to use that term, but the long future as well, or to draw from indigenous peoples here in North America, the idea of 7 generations in the past and 7 generations in the future is what gives me a sense of hope. Because I think when you work in the broad world, let's call it social justice, it can be grueling and you rarely win in an institutional sense, right? A human rights advocate isn't going to defeat the oppressive regime, but there is a sense of, well, why do you do what you do? And I think having that historical sensibility helps. Okay, so the way change happens and how change happens, for me, comes from new relationships. The way people change their mind, change their priority, change their perspective, and empower themselves often is by changing their relationships, by creating new friendships and relationships of solidarity, but also changing their relationship with the land and with water. So, and also another way is how you change your relationship with your own history and finding new stories to incorporate into your life. So for me, I define political success as creating the conditions that enable people to come after me, to continue the struggle and advance the struggle. And so for me, defeat is when a struggle ends, when a certain campaign or a certain movement is sort of fizzles out and is no longer active. And so I hope you see this when I'm examining and talking about the different legal doctrines. So let me start with the special rapporteur. So a special rapporteur is an independent expert. We're given our mandate by the Human Rights Council. The right to food mandate is very broad and sweeping, so it really gives me a lot of flexibility. And special rapporteurs, there's over 40, and there's different mandates. There's racism, the right to water, health, albinism. Of course, there's the politics of which topics get chosen, which aren't chosen. And you apply, right? That's what I did. I went online and I filled out a form and I hit send, and then I did an interview, and I'm not very good at interviews, and I sort of stumbled through it at 3 in the morning, and it through whatever weird geopolitics and you know, who knows how these things work, they picked me. And I was surprised they picked me because the reason I applied was I had been studying. I'd been studying the right to food movements. I'd been studying the special rapporteur on the right to food. And at this point, I was kind of curious about the process. So I thought, well, the best way to learn about what is a special rapporteur is to apply and to go through the process. And I was taking notes almost like an ethnographer, like I was almost reflecting what I was experiencing while I was applying, and the conversations I was having. People, they're like, did you do a campaign in Geneva? I'm like, I don't know, what do you mean a campaign in Geneva? What's that? So, you know, so I sort of learned about what it meant, because up at this point in my career, I was an academic. I very much in the world of third world approaches to international law, to TWAIL. And I saw my contribution, my political intervention really within the space of TWAIL. And so that meant for me, the institutional space was very much academia. It was about teaching and journals and helping new colleagues and thinking about all of the politics and power involved in those academic spaces. And I was really committed to historical work. And so my sense of being practical really was about teaching, right? So for me, change came from the classroom and that space and the political space of the classroom. And for me, I was really just committed to continue doing historical work. But then my historical work reached the contemporary. So I was doing a history of trade that started in 1870. And so I was moving along, and then I hit now, right? I hit the contemporary moment. And that's when I started paying attention to the special rapporteur. And really, it was the moment where 2 predecessors, so before me was Hilal Elver, before her was Olivier de Schutter, and there was a debate between de Schutter and Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO. And this was in the previous crisis. It's just crisis after crisis, right? This was the 2007 food crisis, when prices skyrocketed and hunger just sort of spread across the world very quickly. And so there was a very public series of debates between the special rapporteur on the right to food and the Director General of the WTO. And I was tracking this and I was trying to still understand, like, what is this special rapporteur? What a weird intervention. What's this even mean? But the real moment where I thought I wanted to apply and I wanted to change my political sensibility came from an academic conference. It came from the 12 conference in Cairo. I think it was in 2015. And the theme at the time was a call for praxis, right? This term of theory and practice operating at the same time. And it's funny to say, like, an academic conference is what inspired me to take action this way. But I think what I'm learning from COVID is to not take those conferences for granted. I think I kind of used to take them for granted and complain about the, you know, the piss poor coffee and the exhaustion and just the endless sandwiches. But I really miss the poor coffee and the sandwiches and hanging out. And you know, to be honest, those conferences were moments of change because it was new friendships. It's old friendships, right? I met Dina first through Twitter, then at a conference, and now I consider her, you know, she's stuck with me for a lifelong friendship, whether she likes it or not, right? So these conferences, I miss them and they matter, but it's what inspired me. It was a call for praxis, and what that meant is TWAIL's political action really was primarily in the academy and remains very active in the academy, but it was a call for us in TWAIL to broaden out into the other institutional spaces. Okay, so I became special rapporteur, and what I had to decide in the very, you know, in those early days of the pandemic is, well, what's that mean to me? And what that meant to me is that the right to food is a powerful, very specifically, it's one of the most powerful particular rights of all the rights because of social movements. There is a right to food community that has, in the last 20 years, really activated this right and really turned it into the progressive, potentially radical tool that it is today. So as a special rapporteur, I decided to commit as much as possible to try and hold myself, if not accountable, but at least ethically responsible, or in the least develop a strong relationship built on trust, if not solidarity, with those social movements. Because in the end, it's their right, the right to food. And the key is, how do I make this mandate the collective mandate of those groups? And so that's an ongoing thing that I continue thinking about. How do I do that? And in basic terms, it's prioritizing my time. Who do I meet? How much time do I give people? If I have to choose between multiple groups, I always err on the side of trying to prioritize social movements and continue that conversation, that relationship of trust, that camaraderie, while at the same time protecting my independence, because the power of the rapporteur is in their independence, after all. So it's this weird balance of working not you know, with social movements, but with governments and other people, but always in the end, I have to make the final decision, and I'm responsible for those choices that I have to make. So I sometimes talk about the mandate in the third person, but sometimes it's me as an individual, right? Those are the things at play. Okay, so let me get into the history of the right to food. So you can find, just in doctrinal terms, you can find reference to the right to food in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It would be in Article 25, but it really derives much of its legal power and meaning from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in Article 11. But if you look at the early legal history of the right to food, it actually starts with the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and Third World politics. So from its inception in the mid-40s until today, the FAO can be understood as a trade and development institution. And this is reflected in the FAO practice, and it's exemplified in the FAO preamble and its constitution. But there's a particular tension that's always at the core of the FAO. Should food be framed as a matter of nutrition and scarcity? Or is hunger best addressed as an item on an economic development agenda that emphasizes the improvement of living conditions, right? The better your income and livelihood, the more you can have access to good food. So as a matter of policy, you could frame it as, should food surplus be used to feed the hungry or improve the economic lives of the poor? I'm drawing a stark distinction. Obviously, there's sort of the back and forth between that. The first Director General of the FAO, James Boyd Orr, who was from Scotland, navigated these tensions, and he pushed for food to be at the forefront of international law and politics when he published a very famous tract in 1946 called Proposals for a World Food Board. The World Food Board's purpose was intended to rationally organize world food production and distribution in order to meet people's nutritional needs and eliminate hunger. According to this perspective, people had to be first properly fed in order to be healthy, and markets had to be stabilized so that people were fully employed with good wages before you could liberalize trade. That was the big economic theory behind it. And so the proposal called for the creation of agricultural international commodity agreements under the FAO's purview. And the idea is that they would stabilize prices. This was the popular idea of the time. With these stable prices, FAO could then fund agricultural surpluses, which would be redirected to countries with food needs. So FAO would be sort of this center point to direct food in a particular way. This, in effect, competed with the proposal to create the International Trade Organization, the ITO. This is also happening at the same time in the mid-40s. So under the proposed ITO, agricultural goods would be under international commodity agreements, and manufactured products would be under the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And all of this was supposed to be under the ITO, the big umbrella of the ITO. So what happens though is the ITO collapses and we're left with the GATT on its own, but also international commodity agreements continued on their own. But also what remained is in GATT, there was a provision to say, okay, GATT is about liberalizing trade. However, we're gonna carve out an exception for those international commodity agreements over there. And for the trade folk, this is under Article 20, right? The biggest exceptions there, specifically Article 20H. So that's still in play. And so I'm going to come back to that point. It's sort of, it's almost like a message in the bottle from the past, right? And I end up trying to pick it up and run with it. So now the US and British diplomats did not like Orr's idea. They wanted the action to be at the International Trade Organization. And they tried to convince him, please, let's not do it there. Withdraw your proposal. He refused. He refused. So you had these competing ideas of the World Food Board versus the ITO. Well, the World Food Board idea doesn't end up taking off. And then the ITO collapses, leaving, again, GATT and international commodity agreements without an overriding institution to connect them. And that becomes trade politics up until really the 90s, right? This tension between commodity agreements and GATT and different institutions playing different roles. So trade wasn't the singular institution of today of just the WTO. You had a lot of different institutions in play. Now, soon after James Boyd Orr, a new director general comes into play. His name was B.R. Sen. He was from India. And he makes food a development issue, right? He brings this third worldist sensibility. And he's the reason we have the right to food defined the way we have it today. It comes from Sen, from the FAO. And the story goes like this. So in March 1963, Sen assembles 29 eminent experts, right? And he says, the language he says, they're bringing their moral authority to bear on the aims and purposes. And this kicks off his Freedom from Hunger campaign. And this campaign is what energizes Sen. And he takes this campaign and he goes to the treaty negotiations for the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And he's the one who says, this right to food thing that you're all talking about under Article 11, let's add a few more things. And it's because of Sen from the FAO that the right to food is actually enumerated in greater detail than other rights. So for the human rights people, you might be familiar, Article 11 is a broad provision that addresses the right to adequate standard of living. Within that right of adequate standard of living, you have things like adequate food, clothing, housing, and the continuous improvement of living conditions. That's where we get the right to food today in its modern sense. But then right after that first paragraph, then you have another paragraph that outlines what the right to food means in detail, and it includes trade, right? For my purposes, this is the most important. So Article 11, 2B, the right to food requires member states to take into account the problems of both food importing and food exporting countries to ensure an equitable distribution of world food supplies in relation to need. So the right to food built into it is trade. It's there for the taking. Sen goes, takes that, comes back to the FAO and says, well, look, if they've got the right to food over there in the human rights, we can't, you know, we're FAO, we can't let that happen. So then they incorporate the right to food into the FAO constitution. So you, in a way, it's linking Geneva, if we say Geneva is human rights, Geneva to Rome, FAO's in Rome, right? So today people say we can't talk about trade in Rome, that's only for the WTO in Geneva. And I'm trying to say we can talk about trade anywhere we talk about the right to food. It's fair game. Okay. So this takes me to my report. And so the report is a weird genre. You have a particular audience, you have a style, you have a word count. It's written, so I write it, but you get friends, help from friends, but you consult also with social movements and member states. And it's written, the primary audience are member states, are governments, but also social movements, academia. Those some reports can have a life of their own and influence in the world of ideas, broadly speaking. And the point I tried to make, and what I tried to do in this particular report, is to show that another world is possible, right? To use that slogan from the mid-1990s. So what I do in that report is provide a legal and institutional map that basically says, look, you governments and social movements have the authority to change things. So you can't use law as an argument for not changing things. Don't hide behind the law as it is to say you can't do anything. I'm telling you the law authorizes you to change stuff. And so I'm trying to make the conversation around trade and food policy to be in more politically clear and legally creative terms. And I make two arguments in the report. One, I argue that the WTO agreement on agriculture was, the way it was negotiated was based on an international consensus and bargain. And that bargain has failed, and therefore we should just move on. It's been a dead end. And the bargain was this. It starts in 1986. And going into the Uruguay rounds that lead to the creation of the WTO, starting in 1986, the understanding amongst all the world governments was that eventually developed countries were going to reduce their subsidies, their agricultural subsidies, and allow food and agricultural products to come in from what were former colonies, right? That's their competitive advantage, were these primary commodities. And so in return, developing countries, they'd say, okay, we're going to open up. Developed countries say, okay, we're going to open up our agricultural markets, but developed countries, what we want you to do is to incorporate intellectual property laws through TRIPS. And the idea being that most intellectual property holders were in developed countries and most agricultural producers were in developing countries. And this was the grand bargain that was supposed to happen, but it never materialized. In practice, after decades of back and forth and wrangling and attempts and exceptions, the agreement on agriculture has mostly supported countries with heavily subsidized industrial agricultural sectors and significant import rates. What that means is the EU, the United States, Australia to some degree, Canada, right? We can predict this. That's who's benefited after 50, after this, what is that, 30 years attempt to do something. So that's what I'm saying is the bargain has failed. The second point is let's wind down the WTO and negotiate international food agreements instead. Up until now, the arguments have been really framed as human rights versus trade. That's the debate that happened with Olivier de Schutter and Pascal Lamy, but that was a proxy for the bigger debates that social movements have been making for decades now. And the nature of those arguments have been very constitutional in structure. And what I mean by that is it was a competing idea of which form of law is going to take, I don't want to use the word trump. We must have a better word in the English language, but which law is going to have a priority or in the hierarchy of norms in this constitutional sense, right? So social movements will say human rights is akin to a constitution and that's what we should use. And the trade law people will say, no, trade should operate as a constitution. This is what was very popular in the 90s. And what I try to do is to get past that stalemate is to say, well, why don't we blend the two? This language of blending trade and human rights. Let's not be constitutional scholars, right? With all due respect to my constitutional colleagues. And so as I mentioned, there's these two doctrines just sitting there that no one is paying attention to. In the GATT, you've got this Article 20H, which says you can have international commodity agreements and they are an exception to GATT. They do not have to follow the rules of GATT. You can discriminate or do whatever you need to do based on international commodity agreement rules. And so in my mind, this provides the flexibility that we need within the existing trade structure. And then turning to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, on the right to food, Article 11, 2b says, the right to food also is about trade. It's, it's fair game there. So we blend these two ideas. So it's not just about then just combining and blending those two provisions, but I argue that they should be interpreted together through three principles. And this was sort of the substantive contribution. This is where I got help from Dina and Sandhya and others. And I say, well, let's have a principled way of doing this. The three ideas, the three values are dignity, self-sufficiency, and solidarity. I think I can get through those in the remaining time. Yeah, I'll do, I think so. Quickly speaking, dignity is really that's with a heavy human rights element, right? Everyone has the right to eat every meal with dignity. This is a reminder that food is central to conviviality, and it's how people take care of each other and take care of other beings. So any changes to a food system must come from the hands of the people themselves and how they're expressing their dignity, right? So this is the human rights language. And I have to say, it's Susan Marks and her sort of recent lectures on dignity that inspired me to look at that. Self-sufficiency, I interpret self-sufficiency not as self as the individual or as the nation state, but as a relational principle. The idea is the self is collective. We always define ourselves through our relationships. That's how I put it forward. So self-sufficiency is it's not about autarky as such. Some countries can produce enough food for themselves, fine. Other countries have to trade, but can they trade on agreeable terms with a neighbor and choosing their neighbor, not necessarily their border-to-border neighbor. And the idea is of a stable relationship leading to that notion of self-sufficiency. And then solidarity. Solidarity draws from this growing area of solidarity and social economics on turning to organizations that are governed by principles of horizontal cooperation and coordination, not this idea of profit and ceaseless growth. So we take these values, we take these two doctrines, and then we repurpose international commodity agreements and turn them into what we can call international food agreements. And what that would take is a ministerial decision. It would take multilateral consensus, right? That's the challenge. That will take years, right? I'm aware of this. But it could happen. We don't have to renegotiate all the WTO. We sort of carve out, and these international food agreements don't even have to be at the WTO, right? They're anchored in the GATT, in the International Covenant, and then it raises it where it could be UNCTAD, it could be FAO, it could be at the Committee of World Food Security, right? It opens up the institutional politics of the game. So I'll conclude in the remaining 2 minutes. So this report, again, is written under this very particular genre of the special rapporteur expert. And I don't think reports in and of themselves create change. So it's weird. I'm writing this report. I'm like, really, this is the report. I have to act as if this is going to transform the world. But at the same time, it's just a report. It's just an old middle-aged Arab clunking on his laptop, right? And but I don't think, reports don't change the world. But when the social conditions are right, a report can help galvanize everyone's thinking in a particular way. And I tried to write the report sort of weaving in all the different consultations and conversations I had been having. And so reports can matter. And as someone writing a report, you get to choose. It's a choice, which historical current you want to be a part of. You can't choose the timing of when or if a report gets picked up. So in many ways, the WTO's theory of trade and development today is actually the continuation of ideas that started in the 50s and you could see in a report from 1958. This is called the Haberler Report that was commissioned under GATT. And Anne Orford has told this story really well. So 1958 is a report, and it's still the dead hand of that report that is informing the politics of today, right? So they frame development in this way about economic growth, market access, diversification of the economy. I think that's a dead end. I'm trying to write in a way that is future-oriented, what feminists might call prefigurative, to create the social relations we might want to create that new reality. I'm writing the report in the context of very specific social relations that are already in play. And I consciously position the report in those contexts of the social movements. So I'm trying to take trade out of the tradition of development that starts in the 50s and situate it instead in the right to food history that starts in the 1960s, but takes off with social movements in the 1990s and continues today with great power and hope. And so the institutional context today also makes me think it's worth going for it. The WTO this year has finally conceded what human rights movements have been arguing since 1994, since the advent of the WTO, that food security and environment are trade concerns. This was a long battle. 10 years ago, you couldn't make that argument at the WTO. What has been clearly articulated by millions of people marching in the streets for over 25 years is now the new policy reality within the WTO. There remains, however, no coherent international food policy informing WTO operations. Just as trade policy is not discussed in food institutions like the FAO or the Committee on World Food Security. More fundamentally, member states are in serious conflict over what public policies count as market distortions and which ones are preconditions for a fair and stable market. No one agrees anymore. There's no multilateral agreement on what constitutes a market. So I'll end there. And I think that we're in the midst of the particular debates and struggles. And I think the debates and struggles today, in the next few years, will determine the new consensus on what is a market into the future. Thank you, and thank you for your patience with my dog.
Thank you, Michael. This was such a rich talk, and I think there was something there for everyone, for the human rights people, for the international trade people, for people who think about law and social movements. So thank you so much. I will pass the mic on to Imogen for comments and Q&A. And let me remind to our audience that if you have any question, this is a good time to start dropping them into the Q&A or the chat function. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. And thank you, Michael. That was absolutely fantastic and really fascinating. I'm going to start with a comment. And, you know, it really was a talk that did have something for everyone. And I'm going to go a bit left field and actually talk about the law of the sea for a minute. Because what really struck me, both listening to you and reading your report, was that when you talk about a right to food, you're going well beyond mere access to food. You talk about food not just as nutritional needs, but as you said today, as food as dignity. In the report, there's a paragraph about hospitality and the idea of hospitality being a cultural value and the need to be a generous host. And then this paragraph from the report that really struck me, the emphasis here is on nourishment and sustenance, not just subsistence. Food should be something that makes people stronger physically, but also politically and culturally. And the reason I bring law of the sea up here is I think there is a thread running through international law that's really interesting about the difference between survival and the difference between a community prospering and living. And so where it comes up in the law of the sea most recently has been the discussion about the distinction between rocks and islands. So what makes a very small rocky feature actually an island, which has all kinds of maritime benefits. And under the Law of the Sea Convention, it has to be capable of supporting human habitation to be an island. And so there's been quite a lot of discussion in that field about what is human habitation. And it's more than simply survival. You know, it's been held that it's not just that there's water, that someone can live there. It has to be actually something that sustains a community over time. And so that really struck me. I think there's that same distinction being drawn in your report, that the right to food isn't just about enough food for survival, it's about enough food for actual, as you say, sustenance. And that then led me thinking to, it's really food as a cultural issue in as much as a necessity. And so one thing I was wondering, when you talk about using 20H of the GATT as an exception, and as you say, you know, this will require a ministerial challenge, which, as we know at the moment, the WTO is a little stymied in terms of multilateral cooperation. Yeah. Whether you've given any thought to, in the short term, countries using Article 20A and the public morality exception as a way of justifying their own food choices and possibly international food agreements.
That's so interesting you bring up 20A, because when I'm not talking about sugar, I'm talking about seal hunting. And that was the big fight in seal hunting and framing the European ban against seal hunting as a moral issue. So my reluctance to use 20A is because of the seal hunting jurisprudence, really. But so let me start with the cultural issue and then to that specific point. So, you know, that point about law of the sea is, you know, I immediately want to read more about that, because that's exactly right. It's existential. Like, that's what's at stake here is, what do we mean by life itself? What do we mean by our sense of humanity, right? It's to not be too trite about it. And food, the big argument from the social movements, from the food sovereignty movement is, we can't just change how we eat or change how we grow, or because what you're saying is change who we are, and in effect that might obliterate our sense of community. And we know from, especially in settler colonies, a key way of committing genocide is destroying a people's culture. You don't have to kill everybody, but if you undo their culture, like we're seeing in Canada with the residential schools, by blocking their language, by taking them out of their families, that is a way of obliterating a people as such. And food is key to that. Food is often the first thing how we define ourselves, especially as an immigrant, he says, pointing him to himself, right? That's such the first thing you sort of freak out about and need to figure out what to do. And also how you almost start to caricaturize your own culture as an immigrant through your food and food nationalism in that particular way. But of course we change how we eat, right? So, but I still struggle as a legal scholar and now practitioner, what to do with the notion of food in cultural terms. What's that mean, and how to do it in a way, because for some reason as law folk, we're uncomfortable talking about culture, with the exception, for example, of Lucas over at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, right? He does that sort of thing. But most of us, I think, sort of, when it comes to culture, especially someone deeply in political economy all the time, political economy, and then it comes to culture, I'm like, I don't know what to do. And so food is forcing me to learn how to do that better. And I've asked people, can you connect me to those that are better at it so I can learn, right? So I can learn, because as you pointed, so what you caught in the report, that just, you know, it's so nice you caught that, is that's my early attempts of really learning in public. Like, that report is me learning in public how to talk about it in more cultural terms within the boundaries of my shortcomings, right? So using language like hospitality and conviviality, but if pressed, I couldn't go too deep. Like it's intuitive, the way I wrote about it. Now on Article 20A, if it wasn't for seal hunting, I would entertain that more. So to share the story with others watching, the European Union banned the importation of seal products, not because seals were endangered. They couldn't make an animal endangered species argument in any terms. And they said, well, we think it's because the seals are being harmed. But they couldn't even prove that the hunting techniques were causing unnecessary harm or excessive harm to the seals. So they had to frame it as, well, we just don't like it. Moral terms. We are Europeans, and our value as Europeans is we are morally offended by seal hunting, unless you are indigenous and it is your traditional way and it's for subsistence. And we as Europe will define what is traditional, and we as Europe will define what is subsistence. And because we've destroyed the seal market globally, they in effect destroyed seal hunting in the Arctic and basically complicated, if not undid, the relationship between Inuit and other indigenous peoples in the Arctic in their direct relationship with seals, a defining element, right? You could almost say that the Inuit are the people of the seal to some degree. And so we could use, like anything, we could use it the other way around, but this was such a flashpoint for all trade law people, that I think the weight of the seal hunting case complicates it in some ways. And it doesn't get me out of the WTO, institutional structure. That's what I like about 20H, is it gets me out, not me, but it gets all of us out of the WTO. So I'm not someone who's going to argue, well, why don't we redesign the dispute settlement system in this way and that? Because my response is, to what end? What's the function and purpose? What's the political ends of what you're trying to do? If the WTO, you know, when people cried, oh, crisis, the dispute settlement, I just shrugged my shoulders. I said, the crisis started in 1994. And from a development and agricultural perspective, the core issue for the WTO, if you will. And now, if you think it's a crisis now, welcome. We've been panicking, you know, we've been in crisis for 20, 30 years, sure, whatever. So I'm of the opinion, let's open up the institutional landscape. But it's, you know, what's interesting to me is member governments still don't have an appetite. So the governments that are the most critical would be the G33. These are the small governments that have a lot of local peasant and pastoralist groups. They rely on importation to some degree, but they have local production. They're even not willing to walk out of the WTO. This is interesting, and that's part of what I'm trying to do, is find out why. Why? Let's give them the courage to be more institutionally creative. In the least, it'll force radical changes in the WTO. Even the threat of leaving it institutionally. So, you know, maybe that dialectic, right? We pit them against each other and then see what emerges.
Thanks, Michael. And I'm conscious of the time. Dina, can I ask one more question, or do you want to go to the...
Absolutely. Also, as long as there are not many questions from the audience, you can keep talking.
Okay, thank you very much. And, you know, just going back from the Australian perspective too, when you talked about food as a cultural right and, you know, genocide by taking away culture, of course, we have a very shameful history in this country in terms of the Indigenous people and removing children from their families and making sure the language got lost over time. And one of the things we're seeing recently, and you know, you can be a little cynical about it to an extent, but we're seeing a re-emergence of traditional food. So Australian Indigenous food being used and marketed and really re-embraced, which I think is really interesting. But the next question I had was actually one that we talked about briefly before this talk. It's just the role of industry in terms of going forward, because one of the things that I said to Michael over email is, you know, in the WTO context, food is dealt with, apart from the agreement of agriculture, food's also dealt with through the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. And the standards that the SPS agreement refers to are those set by the Codex Alimentarius Commission. And one of the Codex was actually set up by the FAO as well. So it's all within this, you know, this world. But one of the ongoing criticisms about the Codex Commission, though it's never really been verified, though again, that's part of the criticism, is firstly, it's the lack of transparency about its processes. But secondly, the very big role of the food industry in terms of lobbying for standards. And of those non-governmental bodies involved, it's estimated up to about 85% are industry bodies as opposed to public interest bodies.
Wow.
So I was just wondering what role you saw for industry in terms of your, you know, taking it out of the WTO, but presumably food industry is still going to be involved in these other institutions, and what challenges that might raise.
Yeah, you know, and your question really, it was really inspiring for me just to start to think very specifically and strategically in those terms. So thank you for that email when you had sent me before this talk. And so there's no escaping at this stage where, you know, we can call it industry. I would maybe transnational corporations, maybe specifically, right? And it's, you know, so I've been active at the Committee on World Food Security, the CFS. This is a body that's based in Rome, and it's where governments come together to negotiate voluntary guidelines. And it's sort of the idea is, if we can come to a multilateral consensus, but it's voluntary on different topics, and then we would encourage governments to implement that nationally. So the latest negotiations were over the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. And what I saw, and the CFS is a unique structure. You have what's called the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, and it's autonomous. They organize themselves, and they have a seat at the negotiating table. But so does the private sector. They have their own mechanism. But so does philanthropy, represented by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So that you call this the multi-stakeholder process. But what I've seen is, when you have a strong mechanism like the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples mechanism, it it's never going to counteract the powers that be, but it has an effect. And you also learn where the red lines are in the negotiations. And one of the red lines was on codex. In those negotiations, governments came together and said, whatever you do, we are not disrupting whatever consensus we have in codex. So between your question and what happened there, it raises in my mind, I'm like, what's going on? What are the politics? What are the specific internal politics of the Codex Elementaris that not a lot of people know about, right? So part of the benefit of a human rights style or having these contestations, and you start to know where to look, right? Your instinct aligns with the politics in play. It's like, we all need to now pay more attention, because then it raises it this way. Do we then say, well, let's open up the codex? Should the codex have a civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism also? If it's part of the FAO and the WHO. So the codex is a joint venture, if you will, to use that business language, between WHO, which has the right to health in its constitution, the FAO, right to food. So you could sort of smuggle it in through those mandates and say, Codex, if you're the subsidiary committee of these two human rights-based institutions, so you could find it that way. Or you could go back to the WTO and say, this is under the committee, I forget which committee, because it's all under food safety. Oh, it's the SPS committee, right? So this is the food safety committee, where it's the Codex, it's the one on zoonotics, on animal health, and the third one is International Plant Health Convention. They all meet under the broad umbrella of food safety at the SPS committee at the WTO. So your question, Imogen, immediately I thought, maybe I need to start paying attention to that committee. I was paying attention to the Committee on Agriculture. In effect, at one point, some report down the line to say, let's turn that to a committee of food instead of agriculture. Do we say it's not a committee on food safety, but let's say it's the committee on something more human rights-y sounding, right? So we start to it puts it in play in those terms, in that way.
Fantastic, thank you. And if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to, because we have a bunch of questions, I'm going to take it to the questions, because they're also, I think, they really tap on these practical and tactical issues you've been discussing. So Anna Hood, who is a colleague of ours from the University of Auckland, she's asking, you noted that you had been interested in praxis prior taking on the special rapporteur role, and she's curious to hear, how have you found being a special rapporteur as a sign of praxis? Does it have challenges? Is it a side of a lot of potential? And her follow-up question is, have your thoughts on praxis actually changed since taking up this role?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question that allows me to reflect on what the hell am I doing in this position, right? It's all colored by the pandemic. So I'm still trying to understand what counts as an intervention. What is action? What is doing something? When is writing doing something, and when is writing not doing something? When is saying something doing, and when is saying something wasting people's time? And that's what I'm learning, is the power of that language, right? As lawyers, in the end, it's just words after all. When is it just words? And when is it the special rapporteur has said? And this is the role I find myself is, I as an individual, but the mandate then makes me someone who is speaking law. There's an authority behind these words in a way that I'm not used to, that others that are used to being institutional actors might be more comfortable with. And so that has made me a better writer. It has made me a better writer in a way. I don't think I've changed my writing style. It's just made me sharper, shorter, and almost given me, I feel I have license to be more narrative, to write in a way that people want to read. Because you read 1,000 policy documents and legal doctrine and this and that, I'm like, okay, the power is there, but there's a power in a well-written sentence. I half jokingly said, right, another world is possible, but there's a politics behind that slogan, right? In that idea, and then I draw, what did I sneak in the other day? Dina caught me on it in her editorial comments. I put, so I was doing a consultation. I had invited certain sets of lawyers with the social movements, and I was trying to describe who are my legal comrades to the social movements, because I want to make it a collective meeting. So that's part of what I'm doing as a special rapporteur. I'm learning my skill is I'm a storyteller and I'm an organizer, right? I like to make friends. I like to hang out. I like to make all my friends become friends. And the line I smuggled in, I think it was sort of like, these are lawyers who are committed to social justice by any means necessary. And Dina caught me on that one, right? But it was me signaling the different political traditions that are in play that I see in front of me. Liberation traditions, Black power, it's in the mix. I see this, I'm not sort of making it up. Different rapporteurs take on the role in different ways. Some are the expert. I know everything. Some are the diplomats, right? Sometimes, and you play different roles. So I'd encourage everyone to think about it, especially if you're early in your career, just apply. My God, if they took someone like me, it means anyone can apply and potentially do this. I feel it's been very rewarding, but you really make it your own. And you're learning on the job. You're really learning on the fly. And I think it's made me a better teacher. Not in the sense of now I have real world experience, this distinction as if the classroom is not reality. So I disagree with that. But it's made me a better teacher in the sense of, because I'm making these choices, and what I do is I share my ignorance and my decision making, and I share what I've learned with my students so that they see that the expert is someone who's learning on the job, right? So I try and learn in public with my students.
Thank you. I'm sure this is really useful for everyone attending, both teachers and, let's say, practitioners. So I have a couple of questions that have started coming in. If that's okay, I understand people might have to leave. We might go 5-10 minutes over time. And I'm thanking Imogen and Michael for their flexibility. An anonymous attendee says, thanks you for your really interesting presentation. And the question is how you see and navigate your own positionality in the context of the opposition to the UN Food System Summit by civil society actors who are concerned with food sovereignty. And I do know you have opinions about that. Yeah. So it would be great to hear that.
So I'm trying to think, okay, I'll try and introduce the idea of the summit quickly and then my positionality. So the UN Secretary General, a little over a year ago, called for a UN Food System Summit. And he appointed as his special envoy, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who is part of basically a large network of agribusiness folk who all are connected more or less through the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the World Economic Forum. And they just held a pre-summit. It was very much like a Davos event. And this is part of the private sector and more specifically transnational corporations trying to influence the UN more and more. And they've taken over, they're trying to take over the discourse and language and power behind the Secretary General's office. And they've signed, the World Economic Forum has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, of the United Nations. So there's this idea that corporations are realizing the UN is a good way to influence global governance, not just the World Bank, not just the IMF, right? And I've played a role in that I was on the integrating team of the UN Food System Summit. So I was amongst the leadership involved in trying to make this thing coherent, but I was also witnessing how human rights was at first excluded from the agenda and then marginalized, and then I was marginalized and more or less shoved into a dark corner. But the idea, and then civil society and indigenous people through a different UN mechanism, the one I described, this autonomous thing through the Committee on World Food Security, mounted a counter mobilization in opposition. They boycotted it and said, human rights is not here in any real way. Indigenous knowledge is not here in any real way. This is a corporate-friendly agenda. We are boycotting it. We are resisting it. And they organized their summit. I participated in both. And I'm in a unique position. I'm on the Committee on World Food Security. I'm on the integrating team of the Food System Summit. I participated with the social movement people. I participated in the Food System Summit leadership. And I'm meeting with member states. I'm meeting with social movements. I'm meeting with corporations. I was invited to the World Economic Forum. So I find myself in this space, sort of center of conversation. And the question of, well, how do I position myself? I'm making the choices at the moment, every day, but I'm always doing it out loud with friends, with comrades, with colleagues, and trying to do it as transparent and openly as possible, because I'm not always going to get it right. But even if I make a misstep or politically it sets things aback, at least I'm open for criticism, right? I'm opening myself up for criticism because I don't care as an individual. They should be criticizing the mandate, and that's a good thing. And that actually, everyone benefits from that. And so this sort of, I had to be a diplomat and an advocate at the same time. And that was a very delicate process. I had to maintain my independence, but lend my advice to everybody involved while being honest. And that's the other thing I learned. I'm learning that how do you be honest and frank in your conversations, but in a gentle and friendly, open way that is not necessarily aggressive? Because by being at least honest, that's all I've got is my integrity, right? That's it. So if people are, if anyone questions, why did you do this? I'm like, because I really thought that was the right thing to do. I'm not being sneaky. And I think that's what saved me, because I've had to deal with people with ulterior motives, like it's normal politics and diplomacy of people lying or half truths and this and that. And I can't do that. Yeah.
Thank you, and I'm sure many will. And actually, one of the comments that just came in, it was with thank you for your candor in responding to these questions. I have one last one, and then I think I will wrap things up. Another anonymous entity is thanking you for the wonderful presentation and subsequent intervention. And their question is, while the suggestion to explore Article 20, subparagraph H of the GATT to negotiate international commodity agreements would allow members to derogate from GATT obligation, I would like to know about, they would like to know more about how would this address the many systematic problems that have riddled the agreement on agriculture since its conception.
Yeah, so exactly, no, thank you for that question. So exactly, the idea is get rid of the agreement of agriculture. Just shut it down. Things end, all things must pass, right? And it's over. But you know, what I've learned is to call, in academia, I think it's fair game to critique. And I always resist the idea of, well, what's your normative position? Well, my normative position is I chose this topic in this particular methodology. And I don't think being normative requires, as an academic, to then have a policy prescription at the end. I think critique is normative and there's a way of doing it. But that's very contextual in a particular genre, in a particular institutional space. In my position, where I think I'm in the institutional struggle itself, I think you have to have that counter position ready. So it's get rid of, to the questioner's point, the agreement of agriculture, I think I share with the person asking the question, I think reform is just not worth it. Get rid of it, but have something immediately ready, because if you get rid of something, you might get something worse. Insert Egyptian revolution here, right? You have to be ready, always be ready. So this is sort of a political idea of, you know, always be ready. You don't know when the revolution is going to happen. You don't know when the institution will be collapsed. But if you're always working together, practicing, mobilizing, learning to do solidarity, learning from each other, you don't know when the time is right, and you don't even know if it's your generation. You pass it on to the next group, and you say, you guys keep going. So this is when I started my talk, I situate myself in the third world tradition. I'm building off of the momentum of the 40s, and the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, right? This idea of a historical sensibility. I put myself into this current, and that humility frees me. That means, look, I'm just one person with a bunch of other people. I'm doing my best. I put my little bit, and then pass it on. And maybe the revolution happens in my time. Maybe it doesn't, right? Who knows?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We are almost 10 minutes past the hour, and I think it's only fair to release both Michael and Imogen and the rest of the attendees who have been very patient. Thank you both very, very much. I think I learned a lot from this session, and I'm sure this applies to the audience as well. This was a very rich conversation, and I think it was really amazing how to see there's even a law of the sea angle that nobody would have ever thought about. So that was really enriching. And to everyone else, thank you for attending. Our next session, as Michael already prefigured, will be on the 20th of August, where Professor Anne Orford will be discussing her new book. Thank you all very much, and have a good Friday.